Thank you, Frank. Well, that was pretty quick, and in broadcasting we would call that UFB, unfit for broadcast, but pretty much what that said is that KYW came from Chicago in 1921, actually it started in Chicago in 1921, came to Philadelphia in December of 1934, moved to Cleveland in 1956 in January, and then in June of 1965, KYW returned to Philadelphia, and that makes KYW unique. And then it was back in June of 1965 that our own Pat Delsey did a switch over from WRCB to KYW Philadelphia. Well, this for me is an absolute thrill, and I really do mean that I'm excited to be participating in this 40th anniversary celebration. I remember years ago, Warren Maurer, who was our general manager, said he wears Group W and KYW on his shorts. I don't go quite that far, but it's pretty close. Before introducing the panel, I have a question. How many of us in this room can remember exactly where we were 40 years ago today at 12 noon? That's a pretty good number. Well, I did too, except I wasn't here in Philadelphia. I remember as if it were yesterday, 40 years ago. By the way, it was a Tuesday, which is a question I'm going to have later. The switchover was on a Tuesday. I was sitting in my apartment in Fairfield, Iowa, where I attended Parsons College, and I was reading the evening bulletin, not online. I subscribed to it, and I got it through the mail. Wouldn't that have been great? It would make college a lot better, a lot easier. There was a short on the entertainment page of the evening bulletin, and it read, KYW AM, 1060 kilocycles, makes a risky format change. It was going to become an all-news radio station. The question was, would people really listen to a newspaper on the air? At that moment, I turned to Nancy, before she was my wife, she became my wife, and was sitting at the front table, and I turned to her, she was studying, I was reading the paper, and I said, someday, I am going to work at KYW in Philadelphia. 15 years later, thanks to Nelson Cohen, Bill Branson, and Bud Gallo, that dream did come true, and I was there for nearly 10 years, and they were indeed the 10 best professional years of my life. My students often ask me to list stories that I believe made an impact on the public, and certainly made an impact on me. I only have a couple, and I'm not going to go into detail, but they'll bring back some memories. 1985, May 13th, moved. In 1981, the 51-day teacher strike here in Philadelphia. February of 1983, there was a 22-inch snowstorm, and a lot of people worked a lot of consecutive hours, and Richard Maloney and I were on the air probably, we anchored together, we co-anchored for about 10 consecutive hours. There was an 8-alarm fire at the gallery in Center City. At the time, it was the largest fire in Philadelphia, and maybe I'll go back to that later on, because that was teamwork, quintessential teamwork at KYW. And then there were two other stories that affected me personally. One was the death of Pelly Lindbergh on that Sunday morning. It was just an awful story. And the other one was the death of our own beloved Jim O'Brien, because again, it affected just about everybody in this room. Well, there were others, but they immediately come to mind. And now our esteemed panel, it really is a terrific panel, and I will keep their introduction short because we know most of them and we want to hear from them. To my immediate left is the longest serving general manager in KYW News Radio history, Roy Shapiro. Roy spent 40 years with Viacom, CBS, Infinity Broadcasting, but it goes back to the days of Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting. He worked his way to Philadelphia in the mid-1980s. Roy is a Broadcast Pioneers Person of the Year. He's a member of our Hall of Fame, and I know you never know this, but Roy is from New York. But he made himself a Philadelphian, and I truly mean he made himself a Philadelphian. To Roy's left is Harry Donahue. He first joined KYW News Radio as a freelance reporter and an anchor in 1974. Went full-time in 1979. Harry's been the morning news anchor, or a morning news and sports anchor for the station ever since. And who could ever forget the days when Harry D., co-anchored those morning drive shows with Bob Witten, Gene Scott, and the late Harry Johnson. Harry's one of the most recognizable voices in Philadelphia. He's a native of Philadelphia, and he graduated from St. Joseph's University. Harry Johnson. Next to Harry is Bill Roswell. Rozzy and I go back a long way. To WCAM, and maybe even before, WCAM in Camden. He also worked at the Suburban News Group in New Jersey, southern New Jersey, out of Cherry Hill, also with the Courier Post. Bill joined KYW in 1980, just after I arrived on the scene. He's listed in the bio as a news editor, but I can tell you that Bill Roswell does a lot more than just edit the news at KYW. He is a native of Washington, D.C., but he too is a true Philadelphian. He's a graduate of Rowan University back in the day when it was called Glassboro State College. Bill Roswell. And I'll embarrass the fellow next to Bill because he is one of my idols, Bud Gallo. I told Bill, Bud, he looks exactly the same today as
just as ugly.
As 1968. Frank asked me to tell the story. I was going to say it, so later, but I'll tell you. I auditioned in 1968 at KYW. Bud was the engineer. You heard about an athlete having a tight butt. This guy had me so intimidated, I couldn't even get through the script. He said, go get a job and get some experience someplace else, like go back to Iowa. And I wound up going, I wanted to go to New York, but it was Bud's fault. Bud is a native of Ashley, Pennsylvania. Oh, you don't know where Ashley is? You do? It's a suburb of Wilkes-Barre. He attended Navy radio school, served abroad on the USS Tennessee, the BB-43, as a radio operator for 3 years, and after returning home went to Philadelphia Wireless Tech. In 1950, he joined KYW. He was there for a short time, only about a year because they didn't use this word in those days. They downsized. So Bud went over to 1210 WCAU, but 6 months later, he came back to KYW as fast as he could. He remained at KYW from 1619 Walnut Street to, don't worry, everything will be good when we get into the new building at 5th and Market. And Bud was there until 1991. Bud Gallo. And the Buds left is Bill Weber. What a history he's had in Philadelphia. But around the KYW building, Wee Willie is known for being the DJ who played the last record, or the last two records, before handing it off to Steve Porter, who made the switch at 12 noon after an introduction from the general manager. And these were the words: all news and only news. And then, the first promo that was played just after that, you can hear this on the Broadcast Pioneers website, set your center button to 1060. How many times did we hear that? Well, you don't have to feel too badly for Wee Willie because he did land on his feet. So with that, we're going to go to the panel, but first I want to recognize a few KYW names and voices out of the past. I know of three, I hope I don't miss anyone. Elliot Abrams is sitting right over here. Elliot. Thank you, Eric. Dave Scalish, who is over at 1210. Terrific engineer and known Dave for a long time. And then to my left is, we know him as Dave Neal. Dave spent so many years at KYW at all three well, I shouldn't say that right, at 3, 6, and 10 in Philadelphia. And Dave was just a terrific editor and has a million stories that he could tell as well. But Dave helped me break into this business as well. Dave Neal, Dave Dunbar. And now I'm going to segue and turn around to Roy Shapiro, because he probably knows more about KYW News Radio and its evolution into the premier radio station still today, the premier radio station in this nation. And Andrea Mitchell said it on the Don Imus show a couple of weeks ago when she was interviewed for her new book. But I have a question for Roy, and that is, whose crazy idea was it?
Well, a little history first, Larry. I think you indicated, correctly so, KYW has the most traveled call letters in America, having started in Chicago, moved to Cleveland, moved to Philadelphia, back to Cleveland, back to Philadelphia. And what had happened was, I think the handwriting was on the wall even before 1965 or 1964. We were a small little company at that time, owned 5 television stations and 7 AM radio stations, and we had just purchased a radio station in New York called 1010 Winds. And at that time, all our radio stations played rock and roll music. And I think the people in this room will really understand it better than anyone else. In those days, in the early 60s, rock and roll was a dirty word. No one wanted to be associated with rock and roll music, and here it is, we bought a station in New York, and we were playing rock and roll music, and it was kind of an embarrassment to the bigwigs in New York that how can they play this thing called rock and roll music. So I think the seed was already planted when we purchased 1010 Winds in New York. Well, we had been pushed out of Philadelphia and sent to Cleveland by NBC. And we went to the FCC and complained to the FCC that they pushed us out of Philadelphia and we should be able to come back to Philadelphia. And the FCC, we took our case to the FCC, and they agreed with us. So late 1964, the FCC gave us permission to move from Cleveland back to Philadelphia. And at that time, we were called into a conference room. We had staff meetings every Monday morning. And this was late 1964. And Donald H. McGannon was the president of Westinghouse Broadcasting Company. And Donald H. McGannon believed very, very strongly in public service, community involvement, and news. And he was very, very proud of his commitment to news and the success we had as a company with news, particularly on the television side. And we walked into the staff meeting Monday morning, not knowing anything, and he told us we were going to move from Cleveland back to Philadelphia, and said to us, and we still couldn't believe it then, I'm not so sure I believe it today, that we were going to be all news all the time, first in Philadelphia, then in New York City. And everyone just stared. There was total silence. You can hear a pin drop. And the meeting just ended. It was the strangest kind of staff meeting. We walked out and we huddled with each other and we said, do you think he's crazy? Well, what is he thinking? How is this going to work? I mean, when you stop to think for a moment that there was nothing that resembled all news all the time, you might as well broadcast in a foreign language. I mean, it made absolutely no sense to us, and not only did it make any sense to the staff, but we got crucified in the general press, and we got crucified in the trade press of what are they thinking over at Westinghouse and Group W. Well, that was 40 years ago, almost 41 years ago. Needless to say, we've been the most successful formatted radio station in the country. This particular radio station here in Philadelphia, KYW News Radio 1060, has witnessed the Delaware Valley spending almost 25 billion, that's B as in boy, hours listening to KYW News Radio. It's been one of the most successful, if not the most successful formats in the country, all news all the time, and came about only because of the conviction of one individual who had a vision and had an insight that he thought this would be best for the company. There was not a single ounce of research done. This was done all by gut. We went on the air, we had no research, and the most difficult part was when people would ask us, what are you going to do all day? Repeat the news? And we looked at it, yeah, what are we going to do all day? Repeat the news? I said, yeah, we're going to repeat the news all day. I mean, what else are you going to do if you're all news all the time? And just one story with that, that you should be aware of, or here in Philadelphia. It wasn't until 1976 in which KYW News Radio had its first profitable year. Something that business would never ever tolerate today. And there's a story goes that after about 3 or 4 years, we had our first successful month in which we made $2,000. The station was so happy, the general manager decided at that time to throw a party. Unfortunately, when we went into the red, we spent more than $2,000. But it's been a great, great run. I spent 20 years here, and the 20 years I spent at KYW News Radio have been the best years of my life, both personally and professionally. I love the city of Philadelphia, and I never ever want to leave. It's been a dream come true to me.
Excuse me, is anybody driving a red Escort and has 2 dogs in the car?
Yes.
You have to do something about it because they're not going to survive.
Oh yeah, on KYW here in Philadelphia. This is Lee Willoughby with the sound of our million seller tune. At 12 o'clock, of course, KYW becomes the all-new sound of news radio here in Philadelphia. This, I guess, will be the last million seller. We want to play an introductory tune to the good sound of all-news radio. This will be Doris Day's Que Sera, Sera. Whatever will be, will be.
I was out of work.
All right, Bill, that's your cue. What happened that day? How did it feel?
Well, I'll tell you, it was an interesting thing. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who remember, and were in the business at that time, when it got around that KY was going to go all news, that people would say to me, that is impossible. Newsmen would say to me, I can't fill 5 minutes. How are they going to fill all news all the time? So it really was, as Roy pointed out, very innovative. And I think, if I'm not wrong, I think it's probably the longest format, at least in Philadelphia radio. I've been associated with a couple of long formats. IB was along about 25 years, I think, and PDN was maybe 20 years, but 40 years is unbelievable. And they still rank, they're in the top 1 or 2 position as far as the ratings are concerned. Back in those days, they did a couple of things which I think were very clever. Number one, we were playing big band music, and they broke the format twice in order to take the onus off of news. They broke the format about a month earlier and went to million seller songs. That's why Que Sera, Sera was one of Doris Day's million sellers. That was one clever idea. Another one is but it was maybe about a week before they went on the air, they started rehearsing, right? Yeah. And they would record their newscasts in a dead studio, and then the producer would go in and critique the newscaster. And so by the time they went on the air, they were in about their 6th or 7th day of broadcasting, and hopefully they had ironed out some of the kinks. They were very fair to us. We were at 1619 Walnut Street. They invited all of us to become newsmen, and many of us did. Bill Branson, you remember that voice, that name? He's on our Hall of Fame, one of our broadcast pioneers. Vince Lee, is that a name that you might remember? He switched over. John Franklin, remember that? They used to introduce his newscast by saying, Franklin, the most famous name in Philadelphia, brings you the news. So, but everybody in town didn't think it was going to work. I was talking with Nat Wright. He was at WIP at the time, and Dave Croninger, a very intelligent man. Dave was the president, general manager of WIP, later on went to New York. Dave Croninger said to Nat Wright, watch the wire services when they switch from to all news radio. I want to take a look at it. Nat found it, brought it into Croninger's office. He looked at it. They're going to do all news all the time. Dave said, God, he says, I hope they didn't sell their music library. So he didn't think they were going to last that long, and he was no dummy. So I say hats off to KYW because they are unbelievable.
finer way of introducing this fantastic new sound, one I know that you will thoroughly enjoy and be well informed, our KYW All News Radio, then with this tune from Frankie Randall. Listen to it, I mean it.
Well, we're going to go over to Harry Donahue here in a moment, but Harry, I have to tell you, you may or may not know this, the weather that day was 82 degrees and partly cloudy, and right now it is about 82 degrees, and we would say partly sunny, and we would say today on Independence Mall. Harry, it's been a long time.
Actually, it wasn't 82. I spoke to Elliot this morning. I asked him to look back in his files, and he did a half hour later, Larry. You'd be surprised. It was actually a lot cooler than that, right, Elliot? It was a high of 69 degrees.
Did they not have a digital thermometer in the studio? Elliot wasn't there, though. That was the problem.
Roy talked about the evolution of news radio, and I can remember a couple things that stand out in my mind when I was first hired by Frank Oxuart, was the general manager at the time, a fellow by the name of Fred Walters, who was on the editor's desk the day they went all news, was the, I guess you call him the executive editor, and Nelson Cohen was the news director. And I met all three of them separately and together. And the one thing that stands out in the three interviews I had, the separate interviews, was when Nelson Cohen said to me, you know, here at KYW, the main thing is consistency, and the other thing is we never want to miss a story. And he said, by consistency, when somebody walks into a room and it's dark and they flip on the light, they expect illumination. He said, when people turn on KYW at a certain time, they want to hear, if it's sports or weather or news, it's got to be there. You can't deviate from the format. And the other thing he said was, we don't want to miss anything, because he said, if somebody's driving down the Schuylkill Expressway and they look over the city and they see a plume of smoke, he said, we want their instinct to be to hit that center button and find out what's going on. And we better be able to tell them what's going on. And when you think back the many times that you've probably done that yourself, today, because of all the competition, not only can they get it from us, but they can get it from all local TV stations. If a major international or national story breaks, you have 4 or 5 cable all-news outlets. The main thing, the one thing that survived, the one thing that kind of paved the way, at least in Philadelphia, was KYW News Radio. And we have become also passed on to generations. I have now 3 sons, 2 of them in their 30s, who listen to my station. They never listened to this. They didn't know what I did for 25 years. And now they're telling me, I heard you the other day talking about this, or I heard you the other day talking about that. And you know, it strikes me that here now is another generation of listeners that have been formed for KYW. And we're still attractive. We're still doing things innovation-wise to keep people's interest and to have them depend on us for all the basics and a little bit more. When I first started doing Morning Drive back in 1979, we may have had 1 traffic report a half hour, I think, and it was over the phone. And that was it. Now we have, of course, traffic and transit on the 2s. We have numerous AccuWeather reports. Thank you, Elliot. Elliot now joins us live. That was something he used to record early in the morning, and we'd never hear from him again until the next day. But we have, I think, really kind of like taken that lamp and led the way in terms of what people are expecting from all news outlets, both on radio and now on television. And I'm just proud to have been able to say that for the last 30-some years, KYW News Radio has been my place of employment. But I want to thank Pioneers for having us here today and recognizing this 40th anniversary, and hope there's at least 40 more. Maybe we can all be part of it.
Guys, I hope so. It really is clear, and when you talk to people, and I learned this too from Nelson and others, Ed Belkin, and guys, there's so many names. Fred Walters, whom I met long before I worked at KYW, you turn the faucet, you expect the water to come out, you turn the radio on, and I often tell the story, and I'm going to go to Bud in just a moment. You can put, I'm sure any of us in a room, don't tell us what hour it is, turn the lights out, and we may not know what hour it is, but we're going to know it's either 2, 7, 12, 17:30, 25 or 30. So I'm sure you folks agree. Before I go to Bud, this is what it sounded like.
This is Dick Aaron, General Manager of KYW Philadelphia, and I now present to you the people of Philadelphia and the Delaware Valley, KYW News Radio, all the news, all the time. All news and only news. This is KYW News Radio at 12 noon, and I'm Steve Porter. The Vatican votes in favor of religious liberty. A Philadelphia magistrate may be holding office illegally. Shastri says he'll abide by a UN ceasefire. No comment from Pakistan. The tales of these and other stories coming up. It's a partly cloudy 82 degrees in Philadelphia. The forecast mostly sunny, hot, and humid this afternoon with a high near 90.
You're wrong, Elliot. I was defending Elliot. They didn't have a real thermometer. They sent Bud outside to check it.
Don't let it happen again, Elliot.
And I have to tell you, as I give it to Bud, just hearing that gives me the chills. It's just so great, goosebumps to hear that. Bud, you were there a really long time, Bud.
I'm the grandfather. The great-grandfather. But yeah, and the level was pretty bad on that because I had spent a month in the other studio recording all the jingles and stuff for the all-news radio format. So I hadn't seen what they were doing in the studio on the other side, what was going to become the air studio. And the engineering supervisor said to me, well, you know where all the jingles are. I want you to do the first air show. I said, well, I don't know what the levels are. He said, don't worry, we'll figure it out. And so it came on with a blast. I thought, man, we're going to blow the transmitter right off the air. But it was exciting. It was a great time for me. I'd spent so many times doing the jingles and doing the production work. Things I remember that happened either before or after. I remember going up to State College when Elliot and Joel were getting ready to do all news weather, and I said, where are you broadcasting from when I got there? And Elliot says, in here. He opened the closet door and it was lined with egg crates. It was just a closet, but that's how it started. I also remember Dave Neal telling a young Texas lady to get her hair cut and no more boots. Do you remember that, Dave? But the all-news format, when they announced they were going to go all-news, the general consensus of the employees in the engineering department and a number of people in the programming department was 6 months and flat on our face. And that shows you how much we knew about the business. But Don McGann had the tenacity and the stick-to-itiveness to say that he was going to continue on and it was going to be an all-news radio station that was going to be successful. And I think we were.
I remember, we're going to come back to Bud, I remember in 1980, I just started, I was part-time, and Ed Belkin, we needed a morning drive editor, and Ed said to me, do you know anyone? I said, well, there's this acquaintance of mine, because we weren't really close friends, we were professional friends. I said, there's this Bill Roswell, and he edits a newspaper in Suburban, the largest group in southern New Jersey, maybe in the state, and he writes for the Courier Post, and he has a broadcasting background. So Ed had him come over, and as they say, the rest is history, because Rozzie's been there going on 26 years, correct?
26 years, and it's funny, I mean, I'm the young kid up here, I'm the rookie on this panel.
That's why Steve's so last.
For 26 years, and it's partly Dave Neal's fault for me ending up there, because Dave mentioned something to one of the executive editors at the time, that there's this guy. I had come from a news background, and really wasn't heavy into radio news, because there wasn't that much of it. What's interesting about the consistency of KYW News Radio is, if you listen to that first newscast from September 21st, 1965, it goes for 3.5 minutes before you hear a reporter. And even then it was somebody over a telephone, which I think they recorded in the studio. And Roy, maybe you can correct me. Back then, I think the focus was on news. We have to do news, we have to do news. So I guess the station envisioned itself as a news organization. And it was guys like Roy and the people that worked with him that really got that philosophy to change that, yeah, you're a news organization, but you're first and foremost a radio station. And as such, you have to program things as a radio station does, to compete against other radio stations. And that's why today we have traffic and transit on the tubes, and these little formatic elements that contribute to the success of radio, of KYW radio. So people will listen to it. I mean, it's easy to listen to. You know what to expect from KYW News Radio, and right now it's 11:31. We're doing the headline traffic, and in 30 seconds we're going to have the traffic report.
It's 1:31, Ross. KYW News.
It's 11:31 in Denver.
Yes, he needs to find his watch, man.
His watch stuff.
My watch stuff. The other thing is that, as we mentioned in a piece at noon, when we started 4 years ago, local TV news at 11 o'clock was 15 minutes long. There was no Nightline, no Dateline, no Good Morning America. There was no cable TV, there was no CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. There wasn't a lot of competition out there, but as this increasing competition for the listeners' and viewers' attention came about, KYW Radio improved, got better, and met the competition. We've kept up with the technology. As Larry said, the first promo on the station was telling listeners how to pull the center button out of their car radio and push it back in so you could get the station. Try to explain that today to a kid. Try to explain that today about pulling out the center button in your car radio. They don't understand it. You know, now we're on the internet, we're streaming the audio from the website. You can download clips to your iPod. And the half-hour newscast that was recorded on September 21st, 1965 was on a 7-inch reel, probably dubbed from an original 10-inch reel. Today, because of the technology that we're able to use, everything is on this little chip. This is the entire production package that I put together on looking back at our 40th anniversaries. Voice cuts, music tracks, the original newscast, the original promos, all fits on this. So we've been able to keep up with the competition to make it easier for us to get the news quicker and better to the listeners.
Well, there has to be an armored truck watching you, an armored guard, because you got all the original.
This is only a copy.
Oh, only a copy. Okay. I wanted to before I go back and ask. Go ahead.
Hey, just make a well, let's get that out.
Okay.
This was the first gizmo that they passed out, or gave out as gifts, and says here, push the button for KYW. This radio is 40-some years old.
Philadelphia sexually abused hundreds of children over the years.
It still works.
As Roy's getting his coffee, I just wanted to give you an example of the teamwork at a KYW News Radio. When there was that Center City fire in the mid-1980s, the gallery was on fire. I believe Gimbel's was still there, Penny's was on fire, and the general manager's secretary, Muriel, walked in from lunch, and she had just come up the elevator, and Tony Hansen and I were standing near the elevator, and she said, "There's a fire down near the gallery." So we could, the windows don't open, and I tried to see out the window, and we could see smoke, and I just remember saying, "The gallery's on fire," and within seconds, Tony, Richard Maloney, Jay Lloyd, who was visiting that day, myself, there were 5 reporters in all. We grabbed handy talkies, and we were gone. And Bob Katowski, the editor, comes on. He said, "I need a gosh darn reporter. I need a reporter. We've got a fire." And he's going on, and I'm not sure which one of us answered. We said, "Bob, we are here already, and we are ready to go on the air," because we ran the 3 blocks from 5th and Market to 8th and Market, and that's the way it was at KYW, because it was a well-oiled machine on the inside. That's why it's a well-oiled machine on the outside.
Just a general comment. We talk about the format and all news all the time. But let me just make a comment, not just a comment. I was blessed to spend 20 years at KYW News Radio, and I really mean that I was blessed. We had the finest news professionals and dedicated news people that any radio station would want to employ if they had an all-news radio station. And as I've always said throughout the years, you're only as good as the people you hire at your radio station and work for you. And I have to tell you, the news people here at KYW News Radio were the finest in the country, dedicated, professional, passionate, caring, and that's what made the station it is today. That's the reason for its success. I mean, all news, the format, everything else, but without the people, the professional news people, the technical side of the technical people that help get the product on the air, without them, this is not a radio station at all. And I just wanted to say thank you to all those news professionals here today and who I will see again tonight. I thank them because it's because of them that we had the kind of success we enjoyed today.
Thank you, Ron. I know we all have a million stories, but Harry, a story, I mentioned 5 or 6 that jumped out at me, and it's almost impossible because news and sports. What story or stories?
Well, yeah, there's so many of them, I guess. The 9/11 tragedy, watching that unveil as I was on the air, and we did have them when I first started, but we have TV monitors now in the studio. I remember it happened, the second plane went into the second tower during a traffic report we had. We hadn't yet been able to figure out what happened with the first plane. Al Novak, who was our inside reporter every morning, monitors New York stations as well, and he said that there was a report that it was initially, they thought a small plane crashed into the one tower, and he was following up on that, listening to WCBS, our sister station in New York, and during a traffic break at 9:02 it was that morning, I happened to just look up at the monitor that we had from, I think, one of the networks, and I saw a plane go into the second tower, and it just, it's happened, and I came back on the air and I said, we've heard about this thing in New York. I said, it appears now that there's been a second plane go into the other tower. So that because I guess how close it was, and it's still riveted in my mind. I remember being on the air the day the Pope was shot back at St. Peter's Square, and getting that bulletin, because it comes in, you don't have enough time to react, and the editor says, get this on the air. And then there's the snowstorms. I mean, where would KYW be without the snowstorms? One man's trash is another man's trash. And all the numbers. Roy, you said 25 billion hours of listening. Well, 20 billion hours of snow numbers is what it feels like I've read. It's torturous, from a format standpoint, to be the person just reading, 1040, 1041, 1042, 1043, and then you have open but no transportation, 2 hours late, K through, and I'm like, come on, make it simple for me. And I remember going in, talking to Roy and our program director about, can't we just simplify this a little bit, somehow? But people are creatures of habit. And even today, with the internet, and I know parents that use phone chains to call one another about, people still listen to KYW for school closings. And God knows the list probably has multiplied now because of all the nursery and daycare schools that we have compared to what we had 25 years ago. And they still call, and they want to get, and I'll never forget, you get the kids, you don't get this too much anymore, but we would have a snow day, and it's a very sophisticated system to prevent people from calling in and either, erroneously reporting at school or a kid having a practical joke. And you would have some young voice at the other end saying, this is Sister Mary John calling, say hello to school tomorrow morning, it's going to be closed. And I, 5 o'clock, I went, sister, go back to bed, will you? It's happened. But school closings are right up there at the top, Larry, in terms of what KYW means to me, I'll tell you that.
And the listeners think it's a piece of cake, but
Try reading the same number
And how about when your son,
18 times a
and
day.
then your son calls and says, did he say 551?
Yeah, it's gone. You gotta come back in half an hour, folks.
Your memory.
There really isn't one that stands out. I mean, maybe 1985, where we had the move shootout, or the move bombing, and then that same year, Live Aid. But I think it's every day that I go in there, because I'm going to work with my second family. The people who are there are aunts and uncles, brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents. It's my second family, and we really pull in together to cover the big stories. If somebody's got a little problem in their life, we pitch in to, help them out. I couldn't think of a better job that I could ever have in this profession of working at KYW Radio. And that's the memory I have of this radio station, and I will always have.
Bud Gallo.
Yes. Okay. Way back when we just got started, the news director had just hired a graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, and she was going to be his secretary, which she was for a short time. And then one day, Ron Myers brought her into the studio and said, she wants to be a reporter, so let's have her read some news and see how she makes out. So I said, okay. And so she sat down, and we gave her a 15-minute script. She read it in 5. And I said to her, Andrea, you have to learn to speak slower, or you're never going to get anywhere. Boy, you know where she is now. The most memorable thing for me was the 3 Mile Island, when Sandy Sterabin, this is Sandy Sterabin from Harrisburg.
Sandy Sterabin, Harrisburg.
He was convinced that everybody was going to die. He had Richard Maloney up there with him, and he kept telling Richard, "We're all going to die. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. We're all going to die." That was a very important weekend, I know, but being able to work with Andrea to get her to slow down, and then in order to be a good reporter, she went to the Ellen Wood School of Speed Reading. You all remember that? That's long gone. But she would read the Philadelphia Bulletin and the Enquirer, the New York Times, and the Washington Post before she started to go to work, and then she'd go over to City Hall and give Frank their terrible fix. But she was good at that. The other way back when Jessica Savage came to the studios to be on Channel 3 as a news person, and they said to her, the bouffant hairdo goes, the fringe on the cowboy skirt goes, and get rid of those boots. Remember that, Dave? Oh, yeah.
She came up from Texas, didn't she?
She came up from Dallas.
Dallas.
Houston. It was Houston. KHOU in Houston.
But the whole deal was that Larry said I scared him. I did more interviews with people coming in and cutting audition tapes. And the first thing they would do, they come in to do the audition tapes, they sit down and say, "What do they want me to do?" And my answer always was, do your thing, and if they like it, they'll hire you. If you don't do your thing, if they don't like it, they won't hire you. But you can't do something that they want to hear. And I think it worked out very well, because Larry was with us for a long time.
Well, and it's really true what Bud said, because he and Bill Branson were in there, and I said I was really young, and Bud intimidated me, but when Bill walked in, I had never met Bill Branson. And he was bigger than life. You know, we've all been through that. And Bill, as I mentioned at lunch today, and still has a major impact on my life, because he's one of the people, I'll share this with you, this is not a prop. I never leave home without a red pen, because Bill was one of the 2 people who taught me and said, You never go anywhere without a red pen because you never know whose copy you might have to correct. And now on computers we use track changing, and one of my students has the track changes in red. So Bill's still with it. Bill Weber, as we wind to a close, it was 40 years ago today. Think back, is there any one, I know there are dozens, hundreds of things that must have for you.
Well, it was the end of my career at KYW.
Yeah, but something happened along the way.
What happened actually is I was doing a show on television called Tug of War, sponsored by Penn Fruit. You all remember Penn Fruit? And it was very, very successful, and I thought they were going to sign me to a long contract. And a fellow named Neil Van Els called me into his office. He was the PD. He said, "We're taking you off the air." I said, "Why?" He said, "A guy named Mike Douglas is coming into town and he's taking over your slot." And then they tell me that KYW is going all news. Fortunately, at 1619 Walnut Street, at the elevator on the 3rd floor, I ran into Len Stevens. And Len and I had worked together at FIL. And he said, "Hey, I'm opening up a new television station. Do you want to do the kids block?" I said, "Fine," and we turned around and we signed on Channel 17. So it wasn't the end of my career, so I was happy about it. But I think that you really have to take your hats off to a format like this, as everyone at the panel mentioned, was really frowned upon by the public, not so much by the public, but people in the business. People in the business could just couldn't, could they, but they couldn't conceive of this being successful. And, well, shows you how wrong we can be.
Well, skeptics aren't too bad. We all pay to be skeptical sometimes, but I still say we, proved those skeptics wrong. I have two voices out of the pen. Whoops, Bud.
I have one more thing I have to report back to you, and that was earlier Roy talked about the party. And for years afterward, he met with any other people who worked at Group W station, and Group W was the station that we all remembered well. They would say, "Were you at the party?" I'd say, "Yes." That went from Friday evening until Sunday night, and it was Katie barred the door, there was no holds barred, we had a ball.
It was a party. David?
Good evening, everyone. This is Bill Branson from the brand new Liberty Bell Pavilion on Independence Mall in Philadelphia. And this is indeed the 11th hour as we get ready to bid goodbye to 1975 and greet the year of the nation's 200th birthday, 1976. We have been bringing you the ceremonies surrounding the moving of the Liberty Bell from Independence Hall to the Liberty Bell Pavilion on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, just about 100 yards south of Independence Hall.
Hello there. Those words are remembered by many people who for 25 years got their nightly news from a gentle, caring man who looked warmly into their living rooms and greeted them with that simple hello there. Veteran Philadelphia newscaster John Facenda, who died this morning at the age of 71 after a lengthy illness.
It doesn't have to be rapid fire. It doesn't have to be bam, bam, bam. You don't have to have 36 stories an hour. You can have 36 stories an hour. You can also have 12.
I don't know about that today on that KYW format, but before we go to the final cut, I'm going to echo what Roz has said, and pretty much Roy and Harry and Bud, and I know Bill has been through this in his life, but it's really true for my 10 years. I'm thrilled to death with what I'm doing now at Rowan University, but there was never a morning when I was getting up at 1:30, 2:30, going in at 10 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, that I didn't bounce out of bed, and my third-party validator is sitting over there. There was not a day when I didn't bounce out of bed because I was going to work at KYW. Many times I took my son with me, but some days were tough. I'm going to share one other story with you. I wasn't even thinking of this, but I can remember almost every day. I reported 3 days a week, and I was an anchor on the weekends. I never outlived being a weekend anchor, or a morning, we call it morning drive. But the days were tense at KYW. Almost every day was tense. And Bob Kutowski, who we'll see tonight, great editor, incredible work ethic, and he would stay on top of us until we got the story right. I can think of many stories. I'm not going to share those with you. But there was a lot of yelling in a newsroom. If you've ever been in a newsroom, you know there's never any yelling. But Bob Kutowski, much like a good husband and wife did at night, he would, after we yelled at each other using the worst language during the day, he would come into the reporter's room at night, walk along, I can picture it, Tony was in front of me, always, he's so big, he moved, and everything, my desk would fall. Richard Maloney was in the back in those days, he smoked, and then we had two other slots, Ken Globus was there at the time, and we had Mary Jo Malone, and there were just so many. But Bob would come in every night and say good night. And then tomorrow he'd come in and start fighting all over again. But they were great, and that's the way it should be, because we had a product to produce, and we literally had a deadline a minute. And with that, here's another great KYW News Radio host.
This is your bicentennial station, KYW News Radio Philadelphia, Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting, serving Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware from Independence Mall. From Independence Mall, this is News Radio, KYW 1060 Philadelphia. This is all news, all the time. KYW Philadelphia, 1060 on your dial, a Westinghouse broadcasting station serving Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. KYW News Radio, all news, all the damn time.
Go ahead.
You left one out. There was one in there in between that said, "Have you caught the latest? Catch it on KYW." And the second or third time it went on the air, we got a phone call from one of the people who was in the promotion department at the Philadelphia Museum, and he wanted to know, "Did I really hear what you said?" And somebody said to him, "What was it?" He said, "They wanted to know, have you copulated?"
We're going to thank the panel, but to show you about the impact of the jingle, I covered a story once at St. Christopher's Hospital on Roosevelt Boulevard, and there was a 4 or 5 year old from Russia. They brought her over to have major surgery in the Shriners Hospital. And they had brought her over, and I had this, I'm going to give it to Jerry, I'm pretty sure I have it, couldn't speak a word of English, and I go in and I'm talking to the nurses about the procedure, I'm waiting for the surgeon to come down, and this little girl, she had been here for about 10 days. I take the microphone out of the bag with the flag, and in Russian, she sings the KYW jingle. Well, being the reporters that we are, we came back and we made a story out of that, too. I want to thank, go ahead,
I
Bill.
just got I have one quick question. And it was a story that Covington told. Did that lady ever get to hear her record? The story that he tells is shortly after the transition to all news, some woman called up and requested a record. Covington said to her, "We'll get it on right after the news."
And that is a great way to bring the curtain down this afternoon. We thank Roy and Harry and Bill and Bud and Bill Wee and David for helping us. And I guess, Charlie, can we take a couple of questions? What do you think, Ryan?
I got to do that.
You want to do that before we take the questions? Okay, because we're on tight format here. Hang on a second, Bob, because he's going to fire me.
Roy, if you would, on behalf of everyone here from KYW, accept from the Broadcast Pioneers, this is a gift from all of us. Let me read it because the members haven't seen it. The Broadcast Pioneers of Philadelphia congratulates KYW News Radio 1060 for 40 years of award-winning broadcasting. It's presented today at our meeting.
Just a couple of questions. We'll take Roger, then we'll get a couple back.
Larry, one of the things I think that people forget about is that KYW is the flagship station for the Phillies, for their only world championship.
That's correct.
That's right. That is correct. Roger said that we're the flagship station for the Phillies only championship cow. No, we'll hop to the two in the back.
I just realized that I had spent the summer of 1946 at KYW. And I remember that the legendary late Phil Sherry ask Coach. I forgot what the name of the in-house band was.
Joe Frechette.
Joe. The other thing is that now that he's achieved such a lofty career back in his hometown of New York, the career path of Scott Frank.
Scott Herman.
Scott Herman.
Scott Herman.
Roy would be able to answer that.
Your question?
Yeah.
Scott Herman is Executive Vice President of Infinity Radio today.
He's big.
He's the boss.
He's the number 2 person at Infinity Radio, and we'll be here for the next couple of days at the NAB radio show, and of course, there's going to be a celebration tonight of KYW's 40th anniversary, and a few of us will get together tomorrow night who go back to the 1800s with Blue W. Let's celebrate the good times.
What was his position at KYW?
At KYW, they had a quick story about Scott Herman. I had hired Scott Herman as my news director at KYW News Radio in 1985. And I went up to New York, and we went to a hotel, and we had a couple of drinks, and I said, I'd like you to become the news director of KYW News Radio. He said, okay. He said, I'd be very honored to do that. He said, what is the compensation? I said, I was going to pay you $2,000 for every year you were born. Scott Herman was 26 years old then, and I paid him $52,000 to come work for me for us at KYW News Radio. And just a terrific young man, and a very, very good friend of mine today.
Good person. Bobby Kravitz. Let's say Bob first.
One quick story. I was in Philadelphia Bulletin. I was the comic editor with Dale Davis. We were in one of the caged cubicles. The radio was on. They finally tuned it into the KYW. Now picture this. Dale Davis, Frank Rookhauser, Rex Belair, Tommy Gibbons. You all know Tommy Gibbons is the reporter at the Ground House. We're all listening. 10 minutes into your new broadcast, Dale Davis turns around. We're still number 1. Forget it. It's not going to work.
I just want to say one thing about Don McGannon. He wasn't so dumb.
No, he wasn't.
Because I ran an ad agency back in the days when you guys were starting. And he was in a meeting presenting KYW. He said, just imagine, we have the only radio station where people are actually listening to hear what we say. Your commercial will do well. Isn't that right?
He's a good salesman also.
By my math, we're approaching an entire generation that has never seen a working teletype machine. How long until you have to start explaining what that sound is?
I had a guy come up to me today in the news, Bob Kelly. He does traffic everywhere, right? Channel 3, FM. And there's a old teletype machine right outside of our current news director's office, Steve Butler. And just sitting there, I guess nobody knows what to do with it. You know? Right?
Nobody wants it.
And he said, he came up to me, and he's sort of being a wise guy, and he said, this thing over here, he says, now, how does this work? What do you got to do? You got to, like, pour coffee on it or something to get it to kick in? I mean, here's a guy that, you know, people associate with current media and everything. He has no idea what a teletype machine was. And, of course, the signature part of our station is the ticker tape in the background, which is an old, you know, wire service teletype machine. And in those days, it was used primarily so that when you were tuning in, you knew you had KYW on the air. Now, it's a dinosaur, but it's still one of those things. If we didn't have it, we'd feel naked, I think, without the teletype in the background.
But to get it started years ago when we went all news and they decided to use that ticker tape, they drove me nuts trying to filter it out to get all the motor noises out and everything. So finally we got it all down to one point. And I don't know who was the general manager. I don't think Roy was there yet when we did this. And we had to send this ticker tape sound to Winds and to KYW out in LA. And that was going to be the signature for all news radio in the 3 different cities. It's a pain now.
We got 30 seconds, and then
I'd like to pay tribute to the late, but still a surviving member of the KYW team,
Dick Covington.
Yes.
He's outlived a lot of people, though he died a couple of years ago.
Absolutely. 15 seconds, Pat.
Very quickly, go back 40 years, why did they do something? There were so many theories and so forth. One thing that was key then, and Billy remembers, and I worked there as well at the time, the story was that WRCV had such a poor listenership that Philadelphia Police Radio had more listeners than WRCV. So whatever they would have go to at that time had to be better successful. Certainly was.
Three up in the Northeast that had better ratings than we did.
Well, the Q even today is around, I think I'm close, 1.25, close, almost 1.3 million people, and there are now 72 radio stations. And back when I went to work there in 1980, there were only 28 listed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Well, KYW News Time 202, notice we don't say is 202. KYW News Time 202, we thank the entire panel. We thank all of you. It was an exciting time. I enjoyed myself. I know they did, and we hope you did too.